Hi friends, welcome back to the channel at the Anástasis Center. My name is Mako Nagasawa, I'm the director, and we are doing something fun in this series. We're exploring the theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I hope you're fans. If you're not, I hope to encourage you to become one. We are on number 2. If you haven't seen or heard session number 1, please do go back and listen to that, because I did an introduction to J.R.R. Tolkien himself and some of his interests and major influences and goals in writing The Lord of the Rings. All right, so let's jump into the story itself, though. We are now in this section, Theodicy, a good God and the problem of evil. Let me begin by reading from the beginning of the Silmarillion. Now, just in case you're not aware, if you don't know what the Silmarillion is, it is kind of the prequel to The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. It was published in 1977, I believe, by J.R.R. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, who was the kind of a literary executor and main person to gather up all of Tolkien's notes and things. So J.R.R. Tolkien died in 1973. So the Silmarillion was a huge effort by his son Christopher to put out there this background material, which is wonderful when it comes to world building and all of these references that Tolkien actually made in Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, which we would have no idea what those things meant unless the Silmarillion was published. And then there's some other material too. So this is the all the way back, goes back all the way to the creation of the world. And so I'm going to read a short paragraph, and then I'll just reflect a little bit on what kind of story is this? What kind of story is this setting up? We'll do kind of 30,000 foot view of the story and reflect on alternative types of stories. So this is the beginning of the Silmarillion. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. So the god in Tolkien's stories is called Eru Iluvatar, and this god creates by thinking, speaking, and singing. And there is a creation. Later, there's a fall. There's multiple falls actually, but the biggest one, the most significant one, is brought about by a Satan figure, one of the angels, or the Ainur in Tolkien's universe, named Melkor, fell away by singing his own part of the music. And so right away, this makes us ask the question, what kind of story is this? And broadly speaking, I mean, you could divide stories up into happy ending stories and non-happy ending stories. And that is relevant as we reflect on what was Tolkien doing, and how do we enjoy the story, and maybe even more than enjoy it, maybe draw inspiration from it. I will say personally that this story has really been a huge encouragement to me. You might have noticed that there's been a 2 or 3 month gap between this episode and the first episode, and that's because I lost my mom at the age of 81. She was in early October. So a lot of things just kind of got put on hold. But I will say personally, Tolkien's stories have really encouraged me during this time and lifted me up. And a lot of it is related to what kind of story is this? This is a happy ending story. But here's some things to notice. What do these movies have in common? I assume you all as listeners have some experience with movies, some of them at least, and here are a few to notice. Up in the Air, The Social Network, Romeo and Juliet, The Butterfly Effect, The Departed, Blood Diamond, Pay It Forward, Boys Don't Cry, Gangs of New York, Scarface, Atonement, Moulin Rouge, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and My Sister's Keeper. What do these movies have in common? Not the same actors, but it's the same story arc, which is that there is no happy ending. A few years ago, my wife and I watched this movie called The International with Clive Owen and Naomi Watts. It is totally depressing because in the end, the evil banks win. And I walked away from it feeling like, what did I do? I don't need to be reminded of this kind of stuff, right? So sad. And there are songs with no happy ending. Don't Stop Believing by Journey, Changes by Tupac, The Way It Is by Bruce Hornsby, The End of the Innocents by Don Henley, and Fast Car by Tracy Chapman. They are really sad. They're poignant. I mean, I don't mean to say that I don't like them. I like them very much. They're gritty, they're realistic, but that's exactly what makes them sad, is that these songs don't end on a happy note. That often they end on a sad, discouraging, or depressing note. There are books with no happy ending. If you're a high school student, or if you were a high school student in the United States, you probably read one of these two books, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, and a separate piece by John Knowles. You know, it's really important to point out that Golding and Knowles were post-World War II writers reflecting and wrestling with some of the things that World War II made us reflect on. And you might say, well, these are really sad. Well, yes, they're gritty and realistic. And that gets at, as far as the stories themselves, that some stories are kind of fatalistic. They don't resolve, or they just repeat themselves, or they have an implied repetition where good and evil are going to coexist forever in a circular non-story. So it doesn't mean that people don't have like a personal story, but in terms of the meta narrative, the big picture, the big story that's being told, it just goes round and round and round. And so here's some symbols that are from worldviews that are interesting. They are circular. So the Om symbol, the yin yang symbol, and the spiral galaxy symbol, to some degree, that they reflect belief systems where there is no good and evil, or the good and evil kind of are equally matched, so they will just go round and around forever. That's fatalistic in many ways. And that's contrasted with the hero story. In hero stories, there's a hero and a villain, or a hero and a tragic hero. There's a situation, right? These are stories where good defeats evil, and there's some kind of linearity to it, where you go is different than where you started. And so, you know, what kind of movies are these? Well, every Disney movie is a happy ending, because kids are the audience, and we want to kind of make them happy, give them hope. The superhero who defeats the villain, the kids who stop the robbers, the guy and the girl who hold out for each other, the family that stays together through adversity, the natives who beat the invaders, the lawyer who persuades the jury of the truth, the scientist who beats the disease, the teacher who gets through to the kids. These are all happy ending stories, because there's at least a situation and maybe a party or a villain that needs to be overcome, and the hero does it. And so the first question, as we think about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, is this a happy ending story or not? Because as we step back, happy ending stories have a triumph of good over evil, and that's on the green on the right. Not happy ending stories mean that good equals evil in some way, either in power or in its nature or something like that. And then the second question is, if you want to live in a happy ending story, if somehow you're drawn to that, and if you're drawn to Tolkien, you probably are drawn to the happy ending story. Is the villain external or internal? And that is, it becomes also something that Tolkien reflected a lot on. So here's a quick little exercise. Who's the villain in the story? So in Snow White, is the villain external or internal? Well, external. In Transformers, you know, the first one, is the villain external or internal? External to the hero, that is. Well, external. In Star Wars 4, 5, and 6, is the villain external or internal to the hero, Luke Skywalker? Well, actually both, right? Luke has to battle not only his father, Darth Vader, and the Emperor, but he also has to battle his temptation to fall towards the dark side. And then in Lord of the Rings, is the villain external or internal? Well, it's true that there is a Sauron, who is the external villain, but there's some kind of internal villain or internal struggle that needs to be overcome. And I will say, I think that the stories that have both the external and internal threats to the hero are more interesting, right? They're more textured, they're more psychologically like really interesting, and they make for better stories, more interesting stories. And so, you know, this is an exploration. Since we're exploring the theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, we have to look at belief systems and kind of line them up in some ways and say, to what degree was Tolkien representing Christian faith? Because it's not overt, but it is there. And the first question to look at is, well, belief, his story does have a happy ending involved or implied. So, but belief systems are stories, and they can break down like this. If you live in a belief system where there is no happy ending, then it is either a story where there are cycles of reincarnation and kind of the circle goes around and around and around. Maybe you can get off that circle and escape to nothingness. Or there could be an eternal war of good versus evil, or you could say there is no good and evil. Now, if on the other hand, you're in the happy ending category, then again, you have to ask, is the primary villain or opponent internal or external? If it's internal, then the problem is human nature, and we need some kind of new human nature. If the problem is external to the hero or the characters, then we need some kind of new government, right? Like a theocracy of some sort, or we need social progress, like better education, or we need more individualism. People need to be freed from their constraints of their background and so on. These kinds of categories, I think, map pretty roughly to, but accurately, to actual belief systems. So in the no happy ending camp, cycles of reincarnation, you could say that's Hinduism. If you can escape to nothingness out of those cycles, well, that is originally what Buddha proposed. And so Buddhism, roughly speaking, is that. Zoroastrianism, at least primitive, early Zoroastrianism, seems to be a battle between two gods, one who is good and one who is evil. And so they kind of circle around each other all the time. And that produces our history. Or there is no good and evil, really, and that maybe is atheism. In the happy ending category, if you say that the primary opponent is internal to us, then Christianity describes that really well. There's some need for a new heart, says, you know, all of these biblical writers. Jesus comes and says, out of the heart come all these evil things. I've come to fix that problem. But and there are, you know, external forces like the devil and so on. But the primary one is internal. On the other hand, if the primary villains are external, then something about our environment needs to be fixed, the structures in which we live. And so if we need a better system of law, possibly a theocracy, well, Islam would advocate for that. If you need social progress, like alleviating poverty or more equality, well, then you could say capitalism or Marxism, get at that. Or if you need more individualism, people just need to be freed from the shackles of their tradition, the morality that they grew up with, then secular liberalism might be that. So you get the picture. So the architecture of a happy ending story means something. And this is where we start coming back to Tolkien and asking, how does he do this? How does he write such a compelling story? In his story, good triumphs over evil without becoming evil. But how? How does that happen? And then also evil, when we look at evil or people who are committing evil actions, then we have to ask, who are they? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? When did they start doing it? Because these questions mean something. Evil could not be original. They couldn't be part of the original creation. So once again, let me read this portion from the Silmarillion, and then we'll kind of glance ahead at the things that Tolkien has said about what kind of ending he is envisioning. There was Eru the One, who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he first made the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. Notice the angels then become partners with Eru for their own experiential growth. A few passages down, in the understanding of their brethren, they, the angels, the Ainur, grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Iluvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed, and the glory of its beginning and the splendor of its end. Notice there is an end to this music, at least this portion of the music, amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Iluvatar and were silent. Never since have the Ainur made any music like this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made. For a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. What a beautiful picture of the original creation. Music is, and kind of the analogy of a song or a symphony is, I think, a beautiful one. It's a powerful one. It gives dignity to both the composer and the original, the director of the music, but also every single person plays an important part. So it accomplishes a lot in Tolkien. And if you'll notice that getting to know an infinite being logically requires growth for the created beings. And that's what we see with the Ainur, with the angels. Later, we'll see that that's also what it means for elves, dwarves, and men, and ants and other things. But we see it in the very beginning here. And that makes sense, because when you think about a story and you're asking, does this story hold together? Are there gaps, or are there plot holes? Are there logical points of disconnection where the story doesn't hang together? At least in some big ways, Tolkien's world really does hang together. You have a good God and created beings, which logically, a 100% good God means the possibility of evil, which we see with Melkor. Why is that? Because one of the angels could desire things in a disordered way. We'll see that in just a minute. And those beings who are called to grow could grow in a misdirected way. That is possible. And that is required by the story, a story where there's a good God with a creation. Now, belief in a good God requires a happy ending, though, because if your theology is a high ethical monotheism, then your hope must be messianic in a general way. I understand that the Jewish and Christian traditions use that word in a particular, with a particular meaning, but messianic in its most general sense means that there must be a return to an originally good condition, and that has to be brought about by some kind of human partnership. So there must be defeat of evil, because a God who is 100% good has to defeat evil in some form and in some way. So here's what we see in the rest of the Silmarillion. This is the origin of Melkor's discord. Straightway, discord rose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his, rather than to the thought which they had at first, which was from Eru. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters that made war, one upon another, in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it, and again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others, for it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes, and it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice, but it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook and a tremor ran out into the silences yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor, but that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar. Those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." This passage in the Silmarillion is really paradigmatic, and you could mentally underline the phrase, "shall prove but mine instrument." I owe it to Alan Sisto and Sean Marchese over at the Prancing Pony podcast. They take these words, "shall prove but mine instrument," and make it an acronym of SPBIMI. So you could think of it as that. But this is a declaration by Eru that no one is going to mess up the music beyond recognition. And anyone that plays something else will wind up being an instrument of SPBIMI, shall prove but mine instrument. And so this is the commitment in Tolkien's world of Eru to make good out of all the things that come. In Tolkien's world, there is a good God who is still involved even when there is conflict between the angelic figures, the Ainur, and that God is trying to undo evil. But does this make sense? How does Tolkien describe the fall into evil? Here is Melkor's story. Why did Melkor rebel against Eru? So this is another quote from the Silmarillion. It came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. He had gone often, alone, into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought of the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. Now that might sound innocent. He just wants to create things, but look at what he wants to do with those creations. When he gets called out, Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger, and he feigned even to himself at first. Interesting. He deceived himself. He feigned even to himself at first that he desired to go thither and order all things for the good of the children of Iluvatar, those are the elves and the humans, controlling the turmoils of the heat and the cold that had come to pass through him. In other words, he created the problem and now he wants to solve it. Now, okay, if he really meant that, then that'd be one thing. However, he desired rather to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them. And he wished himself to have subject and servants, and to be called Lord, and to be a master over other wills. So that is Melkor's motivation. That's how he wants to grow, by impeding the growth of others. So what is the fire that Melkor wants to be to control or to have authority over? Well, in Tolkien's world, it is the secret of life. It's Eru's ability to impart real life, sentience, and independent existence to other beings. And in an interview with Clyde Kilby, Tolkien said the flame imperishable, or the secret fire, is representative of the Holy Spirit. Here's the quote. Very specifically, he told me that the secret fire sent to burn at the heart of the world in the beginning was the Holy Spirit. That is amazing. Again, if you're thinking back to session 1, where we talked about Tolkien's goals in writing a literature that came before Christian literature, that came before Beowulf in English lit, then you would see, he's just using different language to represent things that he understood from Catholic theology, from Christian theology, in this case, the Holy Spirit. So his devil figure, Melkor, wants to control it. So again, does this make sense? Well, yeah. A good God and the problem of evil means that evil is possible, but is never necessary. Evil is a corruption of the good. It's the abuse of free will. It's the misdirect. And evil upsets the balance between order and freedom. Chaos and rigidity result, ironically. So notice, again, music as a motif accomplishes that. We've seen that Iluvatar is endlessly creative, and he can even capture the discord of Melkor. So there is both order and freedom. It allows people to participate. But when Melkor goes off and does his own thing, what results is both chaos and rigidity, because he is not endlessly creative. And so his part starts to sound repetitive, vain, and endlessly repeated. In the end, Tolkien says, Eru will bring about a renewal of the world. So good will defeat evil without becoming evil. Here's 3 or 4 places where he says that. So in the Hobbit, Thorin Oakenshield on his deathbed says, I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. In the Silmarillion, which is elven lore, the elves say, "It has been said that a greater music still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days." And then Tolkien, in a personal letter, which is called Letter 89, speaks of the eucatastrophe, or the good catastrophe. It's the surprise happy ending that happens in part because people are willing to fight for it, are willing to resist the evil, but it happens in such a way that it's just a surprise. And then in another book called On Fairy Stories, Tolkien has an essay, and you can read paragraphs 98 through 100 when he talks about the importance of how what he calls fairy stories, or stories of a fantastic world. The value of it is to end like this. It's to put forward a hope that drives the characters. And finally, a good God delivers on it. So you could see the eucatastrophe in how Gollum is the one who takes the ring into the fires of Mount Doom after Frodo fails to actually cast the ring into the lava, right? Like, that wasn't planned by any of the characters. It's not that Frodo planned to fail. He hoped that he wouldn't, but it was really something of a good catastrophe that Gollum is the one to cast the ring into the fire. And so we can pause on this as we think about what kind of story has Tolkien set up, and what kind of stories in general are available to us. Well, what story do you live in? When you tell your personal story, do you connect it to a larger story of family struggle and triumph? And then if you do that, what larger story exists that's bigger than that? Do you live in a story where good triumphs over evil? Because that really does change how you feel about things, what kind of energy you draw from that story. Or do you live in a story where good does not triumph over evil, where everything winds down to coldness and death and defeat? Or it's just an endless battle and an endless struggle, which is in the end is kind of depressing. That type of story sucks energy and life from you. And then the second question, do your desires for life, goodness, love, justice, and beauty lie to you, or are they telling you something about the truth of things? That's an important question, because if you don't live in a happy ending story, then really your desires for life and goodness and beauty and justice and love and connection ultimately are not telling you the truth. They're lying to you about what will last. But if you do live in a happy ending story, then the possibility exists that they are actually telling you something about reality. So I'll pause here, and please stay tuned for episode 3 of the Theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings.